Hi, I'm Tony Suarez, lawyer, minister, former legislator, law professor, and your host for I Need to Know, where we bring you information and experts on certain topics, political topics on the United States and of Puerto Rico. Today's guest is Professor Enrique Guerra-Pujol of the University of Central Florida. Hello, Professor Guerra-Pujol, the University of Central Florida, a good friend of mine for many, many years, an eminent scholar, which we are honored in Central Florida to have. And I'd like to first thank you for joining us on this podcast, and actually being the first of many that were coming. But you've always been by my side, and many, many things that I have done in the Central Florida here. And you are truly an eminent scholar, and we appreciate your giving us the time. Professor, first, let me thank you. Talk about you. All right. I know a little bit about you because I'm saying you're an eminent scholar, but the people who are watching this, they may not know about that because I know that you're currently a professor at University of Central Florida Business School. Before that, you were a law professor and a constitutional law expert at Barry University School of Law, and before that, I knew you were in Puerto Rico, and La Pontifica en Católica en Puerto Rico. And so you have a long resume of being an educator, and I would like if you would explain to me a little bit about yourself.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to the show. I'm honored to be here, and especially to be the first one to kick off. In terms of background, if we were to go further back, before I began even teaching, and I did start at the Pontifical Catholic University School of Law, wonderful opportunity there. I was an attorney in the law firm of McConnell Valdez. At the time, billed as the largest law firm in Latin America, with its main office in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It was such a great firm. They even had a small satellite office in New York City, and I had the opportunity to work with a lot of clients, both in Puerto Rico and then big companies in the United States that wanted to invest in Puerto Rico and South America, Latin America. Before that, I went to law school. I had the opportunity to go to Yale Law School, and where I got to study with my mentor, the professor who would become my mentor, Guido Calabresi, and really influenced the way I look at the law and look at the world. And before that, it's kind of fitting. I'm here in Los Angeles, California, visiting my family, my mother, and I want to now dedicate this program to the memory of my father. Is what brings me here to California. But I grew up in Los Angeles, and I went to college at UC Santa Barbara. And so, as I look back on life, especially now with this context, I realize, wow, what an honor! I've got to live in all these wonderful places. Got to go to these great institutions, including when I grew up here in Los Angeles and I went to school. And I've got to, and I get to do what I love, which is to teach. And yes, now I am currently at the University of Central Florida. But I will say, I have two loves. Of course, one is Los Angeles, California, where I grew up. But my other love is really Puerto Rico, where I spent, I think, the largest portion of my adult life, and where I began my career, both as a business lawyer and as a law professor, where I did get to teach constitutional law along with Don Pedro Ortiz Alvarez, a very distinguished jurist in the island. And so I made many friends, learned a lot, and all of these experiences do kind of inform, the way I look at the law, and I do consider myself very blessed. And of course, throughout this journey, I did get to meet you, Tony. This was, in fact, I remember because This was, I believe, and when I look back on these important events in my life, we were brought together through. May he also rest in peace, Dean Charles Cupril Oppenheimer, who brought me to the Pontifical Catholic University. Just a visionary, a legal scholar in himself in what they call real property, and also just a remarkable, as a veteran, a high-ranking military officer in the United States Armed Forces as well, a Puerto Rico patriot, someone who loved Puerto Rico. He brought us together, and I'll never forget. It was actually my very first conference as a professor, and it was to this day, it was actually the best conference I've been to. It was in Orlando, Florida. I believe it was at the Barry University, the moot court facility, and you had brought together. It would be wonderful to recreate that on this podcast. I still remember.
Yeah, I still have clips actually of that with we had a star-studded panel.
Yeah, that's when the technology was really coming into being. You know what I mean? Where imagine today, but you had former Governor Romero Barceló, Carlos Romero Barceló, who I've always looked up to, El Caballo, one of the most legendary figures in not just Puerto Rico, but Caribbean politics. You had actually a very close friend of mine, Eduardo Batia, who at one point was the president of the Puerto Rico Senate, and I believe was, a candidate for delegate to the Congress, resident commissioner. We were both at McConnell Valdez at the same time, and we were, although he went to Stanford and I went to Yale, we had a lot in common, beginning with Richard Posner, Economic Analysis of Law. You had the leading member of the Independence Party at the time, who subsequently ran for mayor. And then you brought scholars, and you had this conversation. And you also had people from the states, including people running for Congress, people in office, both Florida and federal. And it was really the only time where the two were, I've been to a conference where the two worlds met. You know what I mean? And I like what you're doing here with the upcoming, and I have to plug the upcoming Puerto Rico, Central Florida, Puerto Rico Bar Association meeting in Central Florida, in Orlando, at the Florida Agricultural Mechanical University School of Law, because again, it promises to bring in people from various perspectives and various disciplines, and that's how really knowledge is produced. Looking at it from I did decide to really remain in academia, so I could choose the topics I wanted to work on. One of the topics, this is what has kept us together since that early 2000. One of the topics has been Puerto Rico, and because it is a conundrum, it's really an anomaly that you have a colony, after so many years, you know what I mean, as part of the American system. As it happens, I don't have it here with me, but a mutual good friend of ours, Judge Gustavo Helpi, had sent me a copy of a wonderful biography of John Marshall Harlan, Justice Harlan the Elder, authored by Peter Canelos. He got me a signed copy of this book and mailed it me to here in California. It is a massive, 700-page tome. I'm halfway through it, just gripping reading. You know what I mean? Because and this is really, I want to make this to the wider audience. If you want to start studying about Puerto Rico, if you want to start learning about really the conundrum, I can think of no better place to begin than with Justice John Marshall Harlan's dissent in the insular cases, in the case.
You've now given me the perfect segue as to what we're doing, because what this podcast is about, and what the conference, which you see at the bottom of our label here, is. It's about a conference that we're having, a national conference, which includes the Puerto Rican Bar Associations from around the country, including many. I can't even mention those because they're not yet committed, but we have many others bar associations that are non-Puerto Rican, but have Puerto Rican committees, and so they're willing to join into this to make this a national discussion. The big problem with Puerto Rico is that everyone is a tempest in a teapot. Everyone's talking inside, but the Puerto Ricans can't vote. They can't even vote for their own future. So therefore, it really depends on everyone else. We have more importance than people in Iowa and Utah and Wyoming. They have senators. They have congressmen. They will be able to make the future of Puerto Rico, but no one knows about this stuff. So that's why we're doing this in English. That's why we're doing this with professors on the mainland as well as professors from Puerto Rico in order to educate everyone else. So that this conference of the Puerto Rican National Conference, Puerto Rican Bar Association National Conference, is meant to educate, bring information to the community about this very, very serious situation in Puerto Rico. You will be presenting a panel in conjunction with Richard Robles, is a litigator from here from Florida, former president of the Puerto Rican Bar Association of Florida, and also our Mr. Gustavo Decos Torres, who is a CPA. And we'll be talking about forensic business and forensic analysis of business analysis. So there's going to be some technical stuff here. Yes. And by the way, let me put out, as we start promoting this, you understand that lawyers have to pay to come to the conference because these classes are certified by the Florida Bar for CLE. But non-lawyers are invited for free. Non-lawyers can come for free to just listen and learn. We cannot do this any other way if we intend to bring the information out. So this is one of the things we're going to be doing. Now, with this course of Puerto Rico, there's two angles. The actual technical, how you're going to be speaking to lawyers about proof, in the law, we have divorces, you got business, husbands that have businesses or wives that have businesses. And then you have to get into valuation. What is the value of the business? How good is it? How do you prove it? It's a very technical stuff. And I don't want to get into that kind of technicality here. You could do that, of course, at the conference. But if you could, talk a little bit about it, I would appreciate that. But how you go about doing that? The other question that I have, which I'm going to lead you into, is the question of business on the island. And there is the question of how do we attract business to Puerto Rico when we see, and you'll have other professors, some of which you've already known, like Heriberto Roman from FIU and Elizabeth Aranda from Florida, from the University of South Florida, who've spoken about the demographic winter. The Puerto Rico is in a decline. I mean, some people call it the demographic death. If you don't have young people, how do you keep business alive, and how do you keep them on the island? I think that's a business decision as well. So I want to talk about these. So let's start with the technical questions about this business of how do you go out proving, yes, and the value of a business. For example, many years ago, don't do family law litigation anymore for various reasons, but I remember this young lady coming and saying, "Oh, my husband has a great business." So what's his business? Well, he brings frozen foods to the bodegas in the Bronx. So he had a very big business, and he would pick up the frozen foods at the wholesaler, and then he would deliver them to the retail stores. Yes. Okay, well, what's his books? He has no books. He does it all in cash. Yeah. She knows she's doing well. She's living in a very nice home in Westchester County. Everything is right, but I can't prove a thing. I hired an investigator, followed him for 2-3 days, and still couldn't determine how much money this guy was making in his business. And so this becomes a real problem for in divorces, in business valuation, when you're trying to sell your business, maintaining prosperity. How do you do this? So can you give us a synopsis on this stuff?
Yes. By the way, it's an excellent question and a very important one, because when we're trying to measure economics and what policies work and don't work, right? If you have not, you have to be able to measure, right, the effects of a policy. And there are and I should say this is very close to my heart, both as a law professor and as a business lawyer, because this is where you bring law and economics together. right? And this is sort of what they call the going concern. And it's ironic that now I find myself at the University of Central Florida, a business law professor in the Dixon School of Accounting, and this is where the nuts and bolts of different methods of accounting, different way of, and this is actually very nerdy, but this is why I became a professor, right? How do we measure costs? We often think of and you also ask the same question. How do we measure profits? Vis-a-vis revenues, right? And so there, and I'll say for purposes of the podcast and to create some suspense and have people come over, there are various tests for determining the going concern of a business. But when you really lift up under the hood, it's very important to determine what are the costs of those business, so you can determine when you look at those revenues, is it really making money? So you can have a business that looks healthy, that looks like it's making a lot of money, right? May have a lot of employees, where you see, like the Westchester County case, you know what I mean? You see all those trappings and spoils, but until you look at the costs, right, you don't really know what the business is really making. And so here, and so this is where intersection of also accounting, right, economics and law, and it's very fascinating because when we look at a cost, that's sort of an ordinary life, right? How do we, let's say, I took my daughter yesterday to the, I promised to take her to the, Chick-fil-A, and I was, as I said, I'm here in Los Angeles. I was, how do you say it? Very surprised how much more expensive things are here. You know what I mean? Basically double than what things cost in Florida. I don't know if the salaries are double, but the things are very much more expensive. And so, one reason for that is, of course, more taxes have to be paid out over here. That's a very important cost. That's generally passed on to the consumer, but also just the cost of the articles themselves, right? And where the raw materials are obtained from, and also of course labor costs, right? And so California, for example, leader in this what they call a living wage or a minimum wage of $15 per hour. I think it was the first state in the nation. And so ultimately, right, these costs get passed on, and then consumers have to decide, all right, do I stay at home and make my own meal, or am I still willing to, pay the cost, and go out? I did promise my daughter Chick-fil-A, so I kept my word. And so this leads to actually, to me, one of the most fascinating concepts in the movement of law, in the study of law and economics. And when we look at, costs and trying to determine the health of a business, this idea of opportunity cost, what you have to give up in order to get something else. This takes us a little far afield from the evaluation, but I wanted to let the audience know, why it'll be worth to coming to our panel, because I'd like to discuss all of these various things, both practical and theoretical.
Yeah, because there's also one of the things that I see it at the
Yes.
small business point of view.
Yes.
They try to work in cash.
Yes.
But then what happens when they want to sell their business, they have nothing to sell or cannot prove the value of their business. And without being able to prove the value of your business, you can't pass on, and you do not create legacy wealth.
Yes. That is an excellent observation as well. The unit of measurement. And this is actually a very common thing that I noticed in Puerto Rico. There was a big disparity between, let's say, the official statistics of the economy and the underground economy, and one of the things I noticed, sort of as one of the reasons why I wanted to become a professor, is when I studied this, I noticed always this conversation, especially among the political class, and commentators in El Nuevo Dia and El Vocero, all the big Puerto Rico media, WAPA TV, is, wow, people aren't paying their taxes. You have this whole underground economy. And because of my training in economic analysis of law, I would always look at it the other way. Maybe the taxes are so high in Puerto Rico that a lot of people move into the cash underground economy, and while that has a short-term benefit, while you can elude, evade or avoid taxes, depending on your perspective here, I would say the taxes are too high, so I'm very sympathetic with small business. But then it can create a longer-term problem, in that, proving what your, the revenues are that you received, you know what I mean, from the business, and then subtracting the cost, what is the actual value of the business, it can be very challenging indeed.
La clínica legal sirve para ayudar a la comunidad que no puede económicamente retener un abogado. Si usted cualifica, la clínica legal te puede ayudar con consultas y representación legal gratis o por contribución mínima. Llama ahora 407-900-2065 en Florida. 407-900-2065 Florida. Yeah, you're making reference, I think, to Arthur Laffer, the economist, that indicates to the point where you can tax to the point where you get zero. And so that's a philosophy, economic theory as well, that makes a lot of sense to a lot of people like me. But it is a question. This is something that I think, though, those who are non-lawyers could benefit a lot by attending. We don't want you to get lost in the weeds of all. This could be a very complex issue, the valuation. But know that it is a solution. That's why we have someone like Professor Guerra and a CPA who's a forensic accountant. This is his specialty. Now he goes and digs in there and finds out, how is it you were affording a Lamborghini when you're only declaring a zero profit or $10 of profit? Meanwhile, you have plans, you've made vacations. I've done a lot of economic criminal cases in federal court where that's how all of a sudden you start showing where money was being diverted from the business into luxury goods, which should not have been done. And so this is among the things that you will hopefully be able to talk about at the conference. There's another aspect, Professor.
And I should say that forensic accounting is a fascinating area. That's why I'm excited to be on this panel, because the forensic accounting, they work backwards, in order to figure out what those costs, and assets and liabilities are, and then to make a reliable estimate, of the value of the business. And it's really detective work. They have to, since we don't have, it's all in cash, so we don't have, ways of corroborating, these figures. They have to make, using these very, again, there's various methods, but using various methods, to have a reliable estimate of what these, exactly. What
so this is how, in divorce cases, this is how you find out where your cheating husband was, was putting money in, or your business partner was siphoning money to his wife or other people. These are very interesting topics. They're very relevant. Of course, they're handled by experts such as Professor Guerra, but nonetheless, they're very relevant to our community, and particularly since we are the Puerto Rican community, for the most part, are business people, and they have small businesses, and some of them are very large businesses, and this will be effective. Which then leads me to the next question. Puerto Rico is losing not only people; it's losing a lot of businesses. Here in Central Florida, where I'm from, we have doctors leaving Puerto Rico, and I don't know. There's some serious statistics about the number of doctors, pediatricians, etc., left on the island, and that has an economic aspect to it because of Medicaid reimbursement, etc. We also have restaurants popping up over here like every other day. We have some new panaderia that's popping up, and we have supermarkets and big businesses that are leaving Puerto Rico as well. So there's an economic factor of this migration that is not just, it's all related, and it's all related. Can you comment on that?
And Tony, I have to, I have to commend you on taking this big picture view of looking at demographics, and this is not the first time that you have, invited me to look at demographics. And, sometimes, this is the one, fair critique of scholarship, where we can get really involved in a theory or, a beautiful idea and lose sight of the big picture. and demographics are very important. Now, I will say here, I'm also as much as much a student, as you are in terms of Puerto Rico demographics, and trying to explain this trend, you know what I mean, and then predict the future. And I would say here, and this really brings to mind, just and again, as the professor, I wanted to bring my value here. This brings to mind, two great economists, or political economists as they were called, back in the day, Robert Malthus, who talked about population and its effect on economics, and of course, I would say the great Adam Smith, the founder, if you will, of the study of economics. And one of the things is, it's a topic that's very important because it goes back to the founding of our of this discipline of economic analysis of law. I should say, by the way, Adam Smith had a degree in law. Before he became an economist, he was.
I didn't know that. I didn't know.
Yes, he has. I didn't know that either. But one of the silver lining of the pandemic is I decided to go back to the sources and study Adam Smith directly and learn more about his life. And so there is definitely a direct. And so I'll tell you what I do know. There definitely is a direct link between the health of an economy and its population, and kind of like the Laffer curve we were talking about earlier. There is to put it in the way I like to simplify it, there is an optimal level of tax. If it's zero, you have zero public services, including zero courts and law enforcement. That, as we've seen with the defund the police, is a bad thing. But if taxes are too high, then you have a lot of underground economy. You have a lot of law evasion. And that also is bad because then people aren't paying taxes at all. So there's an optimal level of tax, a fair tax, if you will, where, and I would say the same thing would happen with the population, right? If you have populations too low or in decline, this will have negative effects. You can say also, if you have too much of a population, right, and too little resources, this is Malthus's point, right, then that could also be very bad. So what you want to have, right, is the if you will, an optimal population, a growing population, and generally speaking, I'm throwing Adam Smith, not just the great Malthus, because generally speaking, a lot of people, this really goes back to the 60s. There's a famous paper by Garrett Harding called The Tragedy of the Commons. There's always been, before this concern about climate change, the concern was about overpopulation. And, the population continues to grow and you don't see that concern anymore. And one of the reasons, I think, is Adam Smith, is, one of the advantages of having a growing population, even when resources may be limited, is a growing population means new ideas. That's why this is so important to Puerto Rico, and this is why it is important, the demographics, age groups, and birth trends. And by the way, I should say this is not just a concern for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is an important laboratory for the developing nations, because you see the same thing going on in such advanced countries like Japan, countries in Western Europe, and also in the United States. You see this problem of a low fertility, and in the absence of immigration, you would have basically negative birth rates. What would be the long-term effect of this? This Puerto Rico has already been, it's already been now decades in the making for a variety of reasons. But by having a growing population, you have new ideas, and you have new solutions, better ways of using limited resources, or even creating new resources. And so that's why it creates and so that's why, having too low of a population is a bad thing. You know what I mean? Having too much, you could say, excessive, where nobody has room, elbow room, would be, of course, bad. But, you want to see, generally positive fertility, and this is actually a problem that is now bedeviling a lot of different places.
Well, I'm going to give this a perfect time to give a plug to our future class. We will have two professors coming in from Florida International and Florida, South Florida, to talk about particularly the population demographics of Puerto Rico and what that means for long-term growth. But again, for those of you who are non-lawyers, you're interested, you see how we can, this really has ramifications for you here, whether you're in Chicago, New York, or Florida, or Puerto Rico. The questions will be dealt with by our panelists. Now I'd like to get a little bit specific about Puerto Rico in the couple of minutes that we have remaining. There is lots of discussion in Puerto Rico over Luma, the electrical.
Oh, yes.
Puerto Rico had a tendency in the past to have government owning it. They own the telephone company, they own the airport, and they own the utilities. Over time, they started divesting themselves and got rid of the phone company, and the Telefonica has been operating well. They got rid of the airport, and seems to have been operating well.
Yes.
Now they got rid of the utilities, and there are all sorts of problems that are having on the island. Everybody's complaining. The prices have gone up continuously. You pick up the newspapers over there. I talk to my family in Puerto Rico, and they're having heart attacks over Luma. And then you have the Puerto Rican Independence part of the PIP is asking for return of the unit back to the people of Puerto Rico. I was wondering if you could give us some intake or take in that discussion.
I'm so glad we're going to come full circle to this, because when I began my professional career, when I was at the law firm, I got a chance to work on some of these, as they were called back then, privatizations of the navieras, for example, the Puerto Rico Shipping Company, the Telefonica, and the competition, introducing competition to the telephone. So, as part of a larger team, I wasn't the lead attorney there by any means. I was just starting my career, but it's something I wanted to work on because I knew this was important, and I wanted to, have that. Learn out of the nuts and bolts of how a government goes about to divest itself of its, and I will say personally, I have some mixed feelings about this. To me, the main concern is not the government ownership per se, but it's the lack of competition, right? And generally speaking, when the government owns, a utility or a public service, oftentimes, the original justification is that the asset being owned or the service being owned by the government was a natural monopoly, and so the government is doing this as a sort of public service. But for example, airports would be a good example of this. Before we have the commercial aviation industry, airports very expensive, right, to develop an airport and the technology to have safe takeoff and landings, right? And so the government, owned the airports. Now, of course, what we see, not just in Puerto Rico, but around the world. One of the things I got to see in Puerto Rico was at one point, and I'm trying to remember, it's the IATA, the International Aviation Transportation Society, met in Puerto Rico at the Colegio de Abogados in Miramar, a few steps from where I used to live. And I was fascinated by learning about the privatization in South America and other parts of the world of airports, because now the natural monopoly justification that really doesn't hold water. And so in the case of Puerto Rico, I will say the public utilities of water and power, sanitation, this has been very controversial going back decades. And I will say, one of the benefits from the consumer perspective is a lot of these prices are subsidized, right? And so when these services are now privatized, right, now that means that the prices are open up to competition. And it's one of the reasons why I actually studied Adam Smith, because the very same problem occurred in the 1760s during a short visit he made, short by his standards. It was at the time, he was in Paris in 1766, something I'm researching. And at the time, just a couple of years before, the physiocrats, the French economists that so much influenced Adam Smith, they had persuaded the King of France to issue a decree liberalizing, that is to say, allowing private competition in the sale of grain. This was so controversial that Paris was exempted from the king's decree. Now, the irony here is that Paris was the largest and most important part of France. And so what you had now is a natural experiment where you have controlled prices in the metropolis, and then you have competition and market supply and demand, right, fluctuations in the provinces. And what you saw is really the worst of both worlds. And I'm using this example because when we're talking about Puerto Rico, it gets very controversial. But when I'm looking at 1766 in France, it's now in the past, we have more consensus. What you saw is, I say the worst of both worlds because in the provinces, right, you had fluctuations, right, depending, and if the weather was bad, you would have higher prices, right, whereas the public was used to subsidize prices, right. In the metropolis, right, it was regulated. That's where the word police comes from. The main function of the police at that time was not just public safety, but also public health, including the regulation of prices. And when you have a market cap, and you have high demand, right, then you have shortages. And so, here's a question of which is the lesser evil. You know what I mean? A system where you have a low price, but then, subsidized by the government, and regulated by the public authorities, but you're going to have a lot of shortages, and a lot of people waiting in line, and not everybody's going to have the bread that they need, the grain that they need. And you'll have black markets eventually, right? And if you're willing to pay, you'll get the grain. Or you want a liberalized system where you have competition, but then, you run that risk that prices can go up and down. There'll always be plenty of grain if you're willing to pay, and so this it becomes one of these very difficult things.
It's a hot issue in Puerto Rico. It's definitely
very hot issues. I just want to throw it out there.
And it has to do, we can't solve it here, you and I. But the thing is, for us to bring to the attention of our listeners, that we're going to be discussing these types of issues at the conference, and you'll have an opportunity to speak to experts like Professor Guerra and other politicians that are coming in from the island to discuss it and to learn. And that's our point. Our objective here is to know that Puerto Rico is part of the United States, and these issues are all related to us. You and I could probably go on forever, but there is one last question I'd like to ask you, because I think that you will really appreciate this. Yes. Recently, the professors at University of Puerto Rico decided to unionize.
Yes.
And they unionized, and the administration decided to fire two professors who apparently had objected to the fact that their classes had been cut. The administration is responsible for deciding how to run administratively, economically, the university. They make decisions to cut. The union now is protesting. The union says, you shouldn't have fired. It's a freedom of expression. We're going to sue you, university, in order to keep this is a classic economic problem of unionization, public administration, what to do. What's your take?
By the way, excellent question here, and you did put me on the spot. And let me just say, this is why I love going to these conferences, and why even though I'll be on sabbatical, I will be there in Orlando, because I actually learn a lot. And I will say, in terms of this issue, it's again, Puerto Rico is a laboratory. This thing is also going on I was surprised, as part of my visit here to California, I took a family vacation. I always wanted to visit my sister campus. I went to school at UC Santa Barbara, so I wanted to visit UC Santa Cruz, and so I went up there. I had a conference nearby in San Francisco. So after my conference, I had a family vacation, and I saw the graduate students were also, unionizing as well, and had a set of demands, in terms of that they wanted the chancellor of the university to meet. So this is something that's going on. And by the way, it's not just the universities, right? You see in the private sector with Starbucks and Amazon. And so I should say, once again, I'm very sympathetic, to the workers and unions, in that, again, looking at this big picture, right? You see CEOs and university chancellors and university presidents making a lot of money. You see, if you will, the frontline workers, the graduate students, and the instructors, right? The professors like me. We have more and more responsibilities. You know what I mean? But our pay doesn't seem to go commensurate. At the same time, you have the students, right? And they have to pay tuition. And so one of the things I've seen here in the UC is that when the chancellor and when the university exceeds to the demands, you do see increases in tuition or reductions in other types of, in new hires of professors. And so I'm gonna end on this note. It's one of my favorite quotes by economist I admire very much, Thomas Sowell. And he said that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And one of the things I love about that quote is because, there's no magic bullet, right? If we don't have a unionization, you may continue to see discrepancies between, why do you have all these university administrators, right, making what appears to be lots of money, you know what I mean? So I certainly, that's why I sympathize, but on the other hand, you know what I mean? Unionization does entail higher labor costs. And as I discovered when I took my daughter to Chick-fil-A yesterday, that's going to get passed on in large part, to the consumer. Now it does depend on what they call,
trade-off. It's the trade-off.
Exactly. It's the trade-off,
Listen, we have to, and this is a wonderful conversation,
yes,
as we always have,
yes,
and many of the things that we've done. Tell us about your new book that you wrote, your textbook.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for asking. Because I'm in Los Angeles, I can't show it up here. But it is McGraw-Hill has approved a new edition of my business law and strategy. I'm honored to be part of an author team with David Orozco of Florida State University and Sean Melvin, my other mentor in business law of Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. And together, we wanted to have a new textbook for business law that looked at it. Tony, I think you would love this because it looks at it from sort of the, manager's perspective, the strategic perspective, how law is used, in a way proactively, right, to gain competitive advantage. And so my background here is as what I brought to the table here is, and part of my scholarship is game theory. I have a number of papers where I apply game theory models to Puerto Rico, for example, and to other problems. Trying to look at, and what's really cool about game theory is, well, I should say it's controversial because game theory, it's a branch of mathematics. So you're always simplifying what is a real life complex situation. But by simplifying, it forces you to be honest to the reader what your assumptions are. You know what I mean? Of course, all depends on the assumptions, but one of the things about game theory is that once you have rules, payoffs, and who the players are, once you identify those three key premises or assumptions, who are your players, what are their payoffs, and what are the rules of the game? The idea is, are you in a situation where there is a good strategy or an optimal strategy or a winning strategy, or is the best strategy just to be random because there's no way of really ahead of time if everybody's playing optimally. And so that's what really this what we do here with the business law and strategy book. And I want to thank also my editors at McGraw-Hill because they really put together a very beautiful and handsome edition.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Guerra-Pujol, the University of Central Florida. Thank you for joining me first and being at all the events that we have put together with Puerto Rican Bar Association. And we'll put your information about your book on our website as well. And for those of you who are watching us and you want more information like that, keep tuned to our channel, the Puerto Rican Bar Association National Conference channel. It's going to be under the name of I Need to Know, which was my signature radio show for many, many years here in Central Florida. And also, you'll be able to get a ticket to come to the conference. If you're a non-lawyer, it is free. If you're a lawyer, you have to pay for the food and for the CLE credits. But thank you very much, Doc. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Tony. And I'll see you in September.